Muy buenas tardes. Es un gran honor para mí y para esta institución casi centenaria de México, el Colegio Nacional, haber organizado este encuentro, la libertad de vuelta. Lo hemos organizado ante todo en recuerdo de aquel encuentro Vuelta, la experiencia de la libertad que organizó Octavio Paz, la revista Vuelta, los que colaborábamos con él, en 1990, y al cual vinieron personalidades, pensadores de todo el mundo, o de casi todo el mundo, para examinar los temas candentes de ese momento: la libertad, la democracia, los autoritarismos que parecían en repliegue, la religión, el lugar de la literatura en el siglo XX y las perspectivas del lugar de la religión también, y las perspectivas de todo ello para el siglo XXI. No voy a mencionar los nombres porque fueron más de 40, todos muy distinguidos. De ese elenco, dije ayer, el único sobreviviente en este congreso junto a mí es mi amigo Leon Wieseltier, editor de la New Republic, legendaria revista, y ahora de la revista Liberties. Norman Manea y Michael Ignatieff también viven y afortunadamente son testigos de lo que ocurrió entonces. Fue un encuentro importante, esperanzador, porque en Europa del Este y en América Latina, para sorpresa de muchos, pues todos los países, como una especie de efecto de dominó, pero al revés, se levantaban del militarismo, del caos, de la guerra, para erguirse con la democracia y la libertad. Bueno, algún día vamos a volver a editar todos esos reflexiones. En su momento editamos 7 volúmenes. Haremos un documental, vale mucho la pena, pero lo haremos en combinación con este encuentro a los 35 años de aquel. La libertad de vuelta reúne a otro elenco igualmente notable de pensadores con puntos de vista distintos, plurales. Somos amigos, pero pensamos afortunadamente distinto. Creemos en la libertad, creemos en la democracia, pero tenemos puntos de vista distintos, incluso encontrados, para hacer el diagnóstico del momento actual. Y como es un momento en el que han surgido tantos problemas, tantos temas que jamás imaginamos siquiera en el año de 90. En el año de 90 el populismo parecía una reliquia argentina, algo como el tango pero menos popular. Y de pronto, con la aparición de Hugo Chávez a final del siglo, el populismo, con una cierta inspiración peronista, pero también con un componente importante de ideología marxista en la relación de Hugo Chávez con Fidel Castro, adquirió, una presencia y una fuerza muy clara en el continente, pero lo que jamás imaginamos, yo no estoy seguro ni siquiera que en 1998 lo hubiésemos imaginado, es la aparición de este fenómeno, pero con gobiernos claramente de derecha en Europa, motivados por varias razones que son temas que vamos a analizar aquí. Y además, ¿quién iba a imaginar la irrupción de ese peronismo latinoamericano en la Casa Blanca? No creo que a nadie se le hubiera ocurrido. Pero bueno, la historia es una caja de sorpresas y tampoco entendimos muy bien la naturaleza del fundamentalismo religioso. Tampoco, en ese congreso, por cierto, nadie habló de China. No existía en el horizonte. Bueno, hubo omisiones, hubo algunos aciertos, me imagino, más omisiones y distorsiones que aciertos, pero en todo caso nos unía un mismo espíritu de optimismo y de esperanza. Bueno, 35 años después, aquí estamos para analizar desde distintas perspectivas los grandes temas de nuestro tiempo. Es una reunión de ideas, una confrontación de ideas y de diálogo, de debate, ideas, diálogo, debate, eso que hace falta tanto en México. No es una reunión de confrontación política, no somos un club político, somos un grupo de amigos que hemos visto siempre con pasión, con interés y con preocupación los temas de nuestro tiempo. Todos mis amigos y los participantes en este encuentro tuvieron oportunidad de escuchar estas mismas palabras, con 2 o 3 palabras de más o menos, el día de ayer en un primer momento de la reunión que tuvimos en la Universidad de la Libertad. Así que voy a omitir para ahorrar tiempo, pero sí lo mismo que he dicho en inglés, pero sí voy a decirles a ellos, welcome to el Colegio Nacional. This is an institution founded in 1943. Here in this place, the most cherished and respected Mexican writers and thinkers and painters and scientists have had a place, and it's here that I first attended the lectures of Daniel Cosío Villegas and Octavio Paz and so many others. So I'm very pleased to give you, to welcome you here, and let's start the discussion on the first panel. Thank you very much.
Muy buenas tardes, nuevamente bienvenidos al Colegio Nacional. Le agradecemos sus palabras a Enrique Krauze, historiador, director de Letras Libres y miembro de este Colegio Nacional desde principios de siglo. Yo soy Christopher Domínguez Michael, miembro del Colegio Nacional también, y paso a presentar a los participantes en esta primera mesa de esta tarde, que lleva por tema Economía y crisis de representación. Participan Carlos Elizondo Serra, que es un distinguido investigador y estudioso de los pesares y avatares de la democracia en México y colaborador habitual del periódico Reforma. David Frum, que ya estuvo con nosotros ayer, es un analista político del Partido Republicano y su libro más reciente es Apocalypse Trump, sobre el declive de la democracia en los Estados Unidos. Y le sigue Iván Krastev, que es una voz muy conocida en Europa, en varios foros de difusión y combate por el pensamiento liberal. Particular importancia tuvo en 2020 su libro sobre la pandemia. Finalmente, nuestra moderadora es Andrea Aguilar, una destacada periodista española, colaboradora de Letras Libres España desde hace 25 años, desde el principio. También participa activamente en El País de España. Y pues nos da mucho gusto dar comienzo a esta mesa y otra vez gracias por estar aquí.
Muchas gracias, Christopher, muchas gracias, Enrique, muchas gracias al Colegio Nacional, a la Fundación Arte y Cultura, a la revista Letras Libres, por poner en marcha estas maravillosas conversaciones y este homenaje al encuentro de Vuelta de 1990. Esta conversación se está retransmitiendo por streaming, nos están siguiendo en directo por el canal de YouTube y por la página web del Colegio Nacional. Un saludo a todos los que están conectados y un saludo también a todos los que nos acompañan aquí hoy. Gracias por venir. Las conversaciones arrancaron ayer, este encuentro arrancó ayer y ya se habló del liberalismo y sus críticos y también de los nuevos ejes autoritarios. Esta tarde estamos aquí reunidos para hablar de la economía y la crisis de representación, es decir, para hablar de las consecuencias que la economía tiene o no tiene en la erosión de las instituciones democráticas, en el auge de los nuevos populismos. Se ha hablado mucho en los últimos años de la comparación con los años 30, con el auge de una derecha muy fuerte, con la falta de respeto a las instituciones democráticas, también con el auge de populismos de izquierda. Creo que es maravilloso que hoy aquí tenemos reunidos a un representante muy destacado de México, una mente brillante de Europa del Este, y también a un excelente conocedor de la realidad estadounidense, lo cual nos va a dar una perspectiva muy diversa y nos va a permitir ampliar el contexto en este mundo en el que el nacionalismo parece que gana y gana adeptos. Aquí vamos a por el internacionalismo y a por abrir la conversación. Quiero arrancar con Carlos. Voy a plantear una serie de preguntas a cada uno y luego la conversación se irá animando y, por supuesto, animo a los participantes a que se respondan entre sí. Carlos, ¿la economía ha afectado a la erosión de las instituciones democráticas en México? ¿Sí o no?
Sí, lo siguiente, no. Let me first thank a lot, Enrique, for the opportunity of being here. I'm very sorry, but I will be speaking in Spanish because at el Colegio Nacional.
I'll not speak Bulgarian, I promise.
At el Colegio Nacional, speaking in English would be, to say the least, strange, especially with público mexicano. Entonces hablaré en español, aunque eso tenga un cierto costo en la conversación. Sí, por supuesto, Andrea, digamos, lo que México ha vivido del 82 para acá, es un bajo nivel de crecimiento y una enorme promesa de que seríamos capaces de crecer mucho más. Si la primera mitad de este periodo, después de la crisis del 82, estábamos digiriendo el populismo anterior. Una digestión que ya se nos olvidó, pero fue complicadísima, la economía quebró. Es común decir que los neoliberales llegaron al poder, pero no llegaron por gusto. No llegaron a vender empresas públicas porque era divertido, no abrieron la economía porque pensaban que era lo mejor, lo hicieron porque no les quedaba de otra. Sin embargo, ese proceso fue enormemente costoso y lo increíble desde entonces es que la extraña pseudodemocracia del PRI, una democracia con muchos adjetivos, logró sostener un ajuste brutal en la economía. Pero no fueron capaces de rehacer la economía en esa apertura, en esa privatización, en esa creación de un modelo neoliberal, por decirlo rápidamente. Se generaron enormes expectativas, pero no solo tuvimos una nueva crisis en el 94, sino que el crecimiento promedio del 2000 al 2018 es de 2.4%. A diferencia de España o Polonia, donde la apertura y la integración con las economías respectivas generó un boom, un crecimiento mayor al de sus vecinos, en el caso mexicano fue apenas un crecimiento como el de nuestro vecino. En un contexto de creciente desigualdad, de exclusión social, en un país que está concentrando la riqueza, instituciones muy débiles, incapaces de proveer seguridad y los principales bienes públicos, más la crisis del 8, el camino estaba hecho para que llegara un líder con un discurso distinto. Y ese líder es, por supuesto, Andrés Manuel López Obrador. Como es una conversación, solo voy a decir una última cosa para que no acabemos en una conferencia, que hay que tener presente que las democracias capitalistas, y solo conocemos democracias capitalistas, no ha habido democracias en regímenes económicos distintos, enfrentan una tensión fundamental entre un hombre, un voto, la idea de que la esfera de lo político es una esfera que nos permite a todos ser iguales, participar por igual, y las mayorías, por definición, tendrían un espacio para tratar de igualar el terreno que el capitalismo genera una enorme desigualdad. Y el modelo neoliberal, en su búsqueda de la eficiencia, generó condiciones de mucho mayor desigualdad y además, atravesados por la crisis del 2008, abrió la puerta a gobiernos populistas, es una mala palabra populista realmente, gobiernos que logran convencer a la mayoría de que hay una ruta distinta y en las democracias pues gana quien logra convencer a la mayoría que hay una ruta distinta.
Muchas gracias, Carlos. Now it's Ivan's turn. So Ivan, we spoke about many aspects, but does economy help explain the rise of illiberalism in Eastern Europe, in Hungary, in Poland, or does it not? How has the history been written over there?
Thank you, and thank you very much. It's my first time in Mexico, so it's a great pleasure to be here. And as we know from Dante, the most important is who is your guide. Nevertheless, you go to the hell or to the paradise. What matters is who is guiding you there. And Enrique, I'm very lucky that I got this first meeting. Listen, economy matters everywhere, for every society, for every political regime. You cannot explain the illiberal turn in Eastern Europe based on the economic factors. And from this point of view, the most important country is Poland, to make this point. When the populist government came to power in Poland in 2007, Adam Przeworski, one of the famous theorists of democracy, said, this should not have happened. And if you really look at the macroeconomic data, for the last 35 years, there is not a single year of recession in Poland. Polish economy is the fast-growing economy in Europe, and even more when you ask people how they feel. Of course, they are winners and losers of transition, but the majority of the Paul said, we feel fine, we're doing okay, we are much more optimistic about our individual lives. So from this point of view, economy does not explain everything. On the other side, it's also not true that the populist governments are totally destroying economy. This is also the other story of Eastern Europe. Basically, when the Law and Justice Party, which is a very conservative nationalistic party, came, they made a lot of other things that we should not like, but on the level of the economy, the economic growth was there, and by the way, the social inequality has been narrowed. Many of these right-wing populist parties in Central and Eastern Europe were functioning like capitalist social democratic parties. So the story, in my view, is in a different place. And from this point of view, I want to refer to a book which in 2011, Harvard economist Daniel Rodrik wrote, which is called Globalization Paradox. And he said, listen, what is impossible for a country in the current condition is to have three goals at one and the same time: democracy, national sovereignty, and the major integration in the global economy. You can take any two of them, but it is always going to be, in a certain way, at the cost of the third. And what we see in Central and Eastern Europe is very much the rise of sovereignism. Because European Union is about democracy and economic integration. So you have a national democracy, but you're losing the idea of the national economy. And you're compensating this with a very strong push for cultural sovereignism. You're coming with a type of majoritarianism. And from this point of view, this is very much going to what you see also in other places. The major message is, I care only about my own people. I don't care about anybody else. And I do believe this is the difference in Central and Eastern Europe. There are Central and Eastern European countries where economy is explaining more than in the case of Poland. But even in the case of Hungary, we should be fair about this. Viktor Orban came to power because of the major economic crisis of the previous liberal socialist regime. And he did certain things. For example, he went against the foreign investors in order to protect the Hungarian currency and so on, which were quite popular. So I'm saying this because my major point is, we talk about populism, but populism is always in plural. There is a famous Swiss joke, if you allow me a joke, about a German boy, French boy, and Swiss boy, all of them 10 years old, basically arguing where the babies come from. And the German boy said they come from the skies and parents find them in front of the door. And the French boy started laughing and said, no, no, of course they come from the bedroom. But here the Swiss boy became very nervous. And he said, do not generalize. It's different from canton to canton. And the case of populism, we have a general trend. But when it comes to explanation, we should go with the Swiss version. It's different from canton to canton.
Okay, great. Thank you, Ivan. So, David, how far, what role did the economy play in the resurgence of Trump, in this Trump-apocalypse that you've written about? And it's been mentioned, inequality and sort of the downfall of the middle class in the US.
May I take a step back and deal with some very basic questions?
Oh, only one thing. Could we speak a little bit slower, all of us, for
slower.
the translator? Yeah.
The science of economics deals with a small number of problems that are inescapable for human beings: material scarcity, uncertainty of information, and the inevitability of change across time. And there are not, in fact, that many different answers to these questions. There are many different details, but the number of answers to these questions is quite finite and quite small. And for many of them in the modern world, the answers turn out to be some variation of either command or agreement, state or market. And that is always what we are debating. And there are differences of degree, differences of detail, but what we're always debating is, how do we solve these problems, scarcity, uncertainty, the inevitability of change across time, in a universe where there are two broad families of answers, command or agreement. And populism, so-called, try to get elements of command at the expense of elements of agreement. And markets and liberals advocate greater amounts of agreement at the expense of command. You often hear in Mexico the word neoliberalism used as an insult. But the truth is the phrase neoliberalism was originally coined by people who advocated neoliberalism, and they did not mean it as an insult. And the question is, why did they think they needed those extra 3 letters in front of the existing word liberalism? Well, economic liberalism evolved in the 18th and 19th century to mean a system of very broad agreement, maximum amount of agreement, but that system was prone to crises, depressions, shocks of all kinds, culminating in the most terrible of the shocks in the 1930s. And coming out of that experience, advocates of market economics said, you know what, we need to learn from some of our critics. And the neoliberalism, which was, again, a phrase coined by people who advocated this kind of change, was to say, we must learn from our critics and integrate into our systems of agreement certain elements from the domain of command for the greater stability of the liberal system. For example, when there is a threat of a boom or a bust, we should have a central bank that can smooth the boom or the bust. When people are coping with the uncertainties of unemployment and old age, we should provide some provision, which will also help, by the way, mitigate the problem of boom and bust. One of the reasons you don't get Great Depressions anymore is because people know in a real crisis, in an advanced economy, there is some level of social provision. People don't fall to zero. They continue to get certain benefits. And that keeps those who produce also producing. So neoliberalism is a phrase that reflects market thinkers' respect for their critics and their need to learn and their need to adapt. It's a tribute to the learning nature of market economics. Now, the advocates of command are not so good at learning. And indeed, in some ways, they're getting worse. There was a period in the 1970s and 1980s when advocates of socialism tried to learn from the domain of agreement. And their efforts, the Soviet Union had some, other countries had others, to integrate elements of market into a command economy to see if it could work. It did not work. The command economies collapsed all over the world, and the advocates of command lost prestige. Now they're back, and this time they're saying, you know what our mistake was? Our mistake is learning too much. We must go backwards, we must be more obscurantist, we must be more primitive, we must be more dogmatic, we must not learn anything from our experience. So we have contrasted 2 systems. The neoliberal system, the market system, is a little bit in discredit right now, but its resource is that it can learn. And the advocates of command, they're a little bit in the ascendancy right now, but they have a disadvantage, which is they always have trouble learning, and they have never had more trouble learning than they have today. They just refuse to learn. They see it as a betrayal to learn. And so I think it's pretty clear where this present moment is going. And we are going to see, with the rise of statism and protectionism and nationalism and command in the United States, in Mexico, in many other places, these experiments are going to fail. And then the people who try to grope out of the failure are going to discover there aren't that many answers. There aren't, and if one doesn't work, you have to try the other.
Okay. Would any of you?
Sí, yo querría, I would like to address your point about the command versus the agreement. Basically, I think there's an element that must be taken into consideration, which is China. China certainly shows the world that there's a combination between command and market, between state and market, that works extremely well. And China manages to live in the world of the market without the consequences that people thought it would have. When Japan and Germany entered into the market, they integrated also as democratic countries, opened their economies, opened their political systems, and became normal citizens of the world. The problem now for this distinction between market and state is that China has been extremely successful in using the market, planificating in critical areas, and as you've seen in the relationship between the US and China, now the upper hand is China with rare earth and other materials which are even more important than the chips that the US could sell to China. So that's why this combination of command and market, I think, has changed. Of course, Mexican state is incapable of doing anything similar to what China did. There are some particular characteristics that explain why China has been so successful. But I think that's one of the reasons why, even in right-wing US or sort of left-wing Mexico, there is this new attractiveness to command the economy, because among other things, neoliberal and the markets create some sort of exclusions that you can only solve through returning to Roderick's main idea. You cannot have at the same time the three, so what Trump is opting for is democracy and nationalism against globalism. And for 30 years we thought that globalism in China would allow them to be less nationalistic and more democratic.
Just to continue on this, because I agree that China is the real challenge. Never before Western democracies have been seeing a competitive economic system. Soviet Union, even in the 40s and 50s, was quite successful basically when it comes to producing high quality military weapons and others, but they never managed to produce this kind of a level of standard of living and others. And here the story is, we were challenged with three assumptions that became problematic. One is that market creates a middle class, and the emergence of middle class automatically creates demand for democracy. You remember the old generation of democratic theories, people like Lipset and others, they're basically going to believe that there is, in modernization theory, almost automatic relations between the emergence of the middle class. And then you can have a middle class society in China, which is not, at least for the moment, striving for democracy. Secondly, big data is changing the way the command economy works. Listen, all the things that the Soviet Planning Committee was dreaming about was the type of an information that you can get now, because this is not simply information on the market, but also social attitudes and others, also totally different possibilities for control. But my third story, and this is the one that worries me most, is that while when we speak on conferences, we see the American, for example, system as the Chinese system as very different in confrontation, I see a much more convergence, and this time on the Chinese side. I don't see, for example, the way how American big technological companies in their relations to the government start to be so different than the Chinese one. Suddenly they became a company, state-minded private companies, and their relations with Trump was very kind of important on this, because the scale itself changes their relations to the government. And I'm saying this because, in my view, the biggest story about, and I agree very much with you that the market has one major advantage, and this is self-correction. You do something, and then basically you earn out of it. But probably we're going in a different type of economy at all. Because you said about economic crisis. Is America in a crisis? If you trust the stock market, not. Basically, level of unemployment is quite low. So this is not 1929. This is not this type of crisis. And if you see also people, particularly technological companies, they're cashing the future. In my view, this is the major kind of a challenge that we see. In politics, populism is cashing the past. Highly nostalgic, by the way, both on the left and on the right. On the future, you have companies that have not produced a dollar profit, who are basically now with a valuation of trillions. And I do believe this kind of a time change is going against some of our assumptions from the 1990s or the beginning of the 20th century, where the technological change changed the nature of the economy.
So even what you're saying about the technological changes brings up another important point, which is AI, artificial intelligence, that revolution, what's going to happen there. It seemed for a bit after Trump came to power in the US that the tariffs that he was going to put in place and the anti-immigration policies would lead to high inflation, and that would eventually hit some of his voters and might get him out of power. Now that is not actually happening yet. Partly, as I understand, because of the AI boom. It's a boom and boost that you mentioned, David. So here, different things that I would like you all to comment. So it's AI and that boom, and then the boost would be COVID. and what happened there. Even you wrote a book about it, so.
No, I'll start. I do believe that COVID is totally under-analyzed breaking point, both in political and economic terms. We talk about protectionism, but to a certain extent, there was a kind of anti-globalist sentiment in any different moment. But it was during COVID which suddenly you realize how much you are dependent for major goods on things that are produced thousands of kilometers away. That created this very major strong push all over the world of we need a type of national economy. I don't want to be dependent on China or on other countries for any medicine that have been produced. It cannot go like this. Secondly, in my view, COVID changed dramatically the way this new technology entered the life of the population as a whole. Listen, there was internet before and there was social media and so on, but the way people changed their life, the way basically we start to relate it to them in a period of 2 or 3 years, and this was globally, it happened everywhere at the same time. This is, in my view, dramatically changing the way of politics. And thirdly, when was coming was that it changed the imagination of the people. I'm just going to give you one example. Imagine that you're a climate activist, and all your life you have been dreaming all planes to land at the same day for environmental reasons. You're dreaming about this, but you don't believe that it's possible. It happened. And if you're a right-wing activist, you have been basically dreaming that all borders to be closed at the same day. You're dreaming about it, but you don't believe it's possible, and it happened. So suddenly what is possible and what is not possible dramatically changed during the COVID period. And as a result of it, when I see many of the governments coming back, for me the major question is what they learned from COVID. For example, the Biden administration decided that one thing that people learned from COVID was that big government is back. They read COVID experience as a Great Depression experience. Because really the government helped, and particularly Biden government helped people. But at the same time, there was also strong libertarian resentment against this. Don't tell me how to live. Don't go after my freedoms. And as a result of it, there was also, I do believe, Milei victory in Argentina cannot be explained without the COVID experience, particularly among the younger generation, where informal sector was basically totally destroyed by some of the protectionist measures. So from this point of view, what we are seeing is you have this major rupture, which in my view was COVID, and then different governments try to make their choices when it comes to Dani Rodriguez's trilemma. And I agree totally. In the case of United States was sovereignty. Suddenly, basically, Trump go and tell to the American people, we were not the hegemon. We were the hostage. We are the biggest victims of globalization. We are going to be the leader of the anti-globalization movement. And when a country and economy on the side of the United States take this position, believe me, this has the effect which basically the changes in the Soviet Union had on the communist bloc. Because America was the biggest insurer of this system. Mm-hmm. And I do believe this is the things that we, and very much goes back to the conference between 35 years ago. Unfortunately, we're unlucky because 35 years ago, you have really first-class East Europeans on this conference. You have people like Miloš and Kolakowski, and now you should live with me. But the story is that this is a major change. And from this point of view, we cannot talk about the economy in the same way we have been talking before.
Mm-hmm. Well, Trump's big idea, to the extent he has a big idea, is to make the American economy look and function more like the Chinese economy. More control over the movement of people, more ownership by the state over the productive economy, borders tighter, more state control over supply chains, and also more and more and more debt. Because when you try to understand the Chinese seeming miracle, how are the Chinese not subject to the same laws of gravity and motion that everybody else are? Well, the basic miracle of the Chinese economy was twofold. One was they had a society with a very high level of education over hundreds and hundreds of years that had been immiserated by crises in the 19th and 20th centuries. But it's like Poland. When the crises end, the human resources of the society propel the society forward. And the second was they used the power of the state to suppress private consumption and to redirect all the wealth, or much of the wealth created by the rebound of a potentially advanced society to state control and in high investment. It's very much the same thing the Soviets did in their seeming miracle after World War II. It's the same thing that other developing economies have tried to do. And the Chinese had the advantage. That's actually the present Mexican government's approach. But it doesn't work in Mexico because your government is not repressive enough to make this. It's plenty repressive, but it's not repressive enough to suppress private consumption so much. But Donald Trump looks at this and says, I don't see a system that is partly rebound and partly making terrible mistakes that are going to lead to disaster. I see this as a model for the United States to emulate at the expense of American liberties and at the expense of American world leadership. So as Yvonne says, with a second Trump presidency, yes, it is true that the global market is in crisis because the country that has underwritten and supported the global market is retreating. Because one of the things that was so true in the great days of our much lamented neoliberalism was in the 19th century, if you were a maritime power of any size, the Netherlands, Denmark, and you wanted to protect your shipping from pirates, you had to have your own navy, which cost money. And if you wanted to protect your people from being invaded and their houses burned down by their neighbors, you had to have their own army. And after 1945, the United States said to its friends, you know what? Pirates, our problem. We'll have a navy, you won't. The problem of people invading your borders and burning down your houses, our problem. No one will have an army of any meaningful heft. All the armies will be integrated into an American command structure. You will not have to fear your neighbors. And all of this will liberate enormous resources for productive use. And the United States can abundantly afford the cost of providing security to everybody else because it's cheaper than war, as the United States learned twice in World War I and World War II. And as the United States withdraws, everyone has to now find the resources to meet their security challenges. Because as I say, the problems are always the same. They are inherent in what is our human nature, and there aren't that many solutions. And when a solution that worked is abandoned, we revert to solutions that have been tried in the past and that don't work so well.
Me gustaría tratar de contestar un poco tu pregunta porque le hemos dado la vuelta. Y ciertamente la economía mundial ahora enfrenta una tensión muy particular porque de acuerdo a todos los parámetros que se hubieran imaginado los economistas, el aumento en las tarifas, lo que tú dijiste, debería de habernos llevado a una situación económica muy distinta. Si bien cabe resaltar que la tarifa real existente es menor a las que se anunciaron, sí es un mundo de mucho mayor protección que en el pasado, nunca Estados Unidos había estado con este nivel de proteccionismo, y al mismo tiempo también es cierto que no ha tenido impacto alguno en la reindustrialización de Estados Unidos. Si uno ve el empleo industrial en Estados Unidos, es prácticamente el mismo, un poco menor de que existía antes de la llegada de Donald Trump en este segundo periodo al poder. Entonces, ¿qué es el cambio increíble, novedoso, una ruptura con la economía en el pasado? Pues es la inteligencia artificial. La inteligencia artificial hoy está explicando prácticamente todo el crecimiento en Estados Unidos, con lo cual además se está desequilibrando aún más los beneficios de este crecimiento, porque como decías tú hace un segundo, pues muchas de estas empresas no generan un centavo, lo que se espera es que generen el futuro, pero quienes tienen acciones de esas compañías ya vieron una mejoría patrimonial importante, con la cual se pueden sentir cómodos para seguir gastando ese pequeño sector de la población. Entonces lo curioso para mí del caso de Estados Unidos es que llegó al poder Donald Trump con un discurso de no solo Make America Great Again, pero de mejorar la situación de las clases populares, mayoritarias, por lo menos de
la clase media,
de la clase media, blanca, industrial, y está lejos de haber logrado eso. No solo no ha logrado eso, sino vimos en la discusión respecto a la cerrada del gobierno de Estados Unidos, pues parte importante del objetivo presupuestal del gobierno de Trump es que aumenten las pólizas de seguro médico de los ciudadanos de Estados Unidos. Parte de los pleitos jurídicos que hubo entre el gobierno de Estados Unidos y algunos jueces, fue que ellos querían, los jueces, que siguieran pagando los food stamps y Trump no lo quería hacer. Entonces, es un gobierno extraordinariamente complicado desde el punto de vista sociológico porque tiene un discurso de inclusión, pero en la práctica tiene una estrategia de política económica que es profundamente conservadora, profundamente concentradora y que a mi juicio, muy diferente del caso chino, si bien hay un gobierno que quiere tener más control sobre la economía, los que tienen el control de mando son las empresas tecnológicas. Las empresas tecnológicas en Estados Unidos tienen un margen de maniobra frente al Estado impensable en las empresas tecnológicas de China respecto al Estado chino. Entonces lo que estamos viendo es un experimento que no sabemos dónde va a terminar, porque no sabemos en qué momento esa promesa de crecimiento nuevo anclado en la inteligencia artificial va a llevar realmente a mejoras increíbles en la capacidad de producir moléculas médicas, capacidad de coordinación en logística que vuelva más productiva la economía de Estados Unidos. Eso no lo hemos visto todavía, pero sí empezamos a ver los costos en materia de empleo. Entonces, la pregunta inicial que me hiciste, que está descrita en el párrafo sobre la conferencia, sobre esta sesión de la conferencia, estamos ante una tensión muy complicada que es una de las razones por las que llega Trump al poder es porque una parte de los ciudadanos de Estados Unidos no se sienten representados, se sienten excluidos. Y olvidados, y lo que estamos viendo es un ciclo parecido o peor al pasado, con una diferencia, que es algo que decías tú que me parece bien importante, que es que la economía, ciertamente en Polonia no lo explica, en el resto del países lo explica mejor, pero hay un elemento central que la política previa a este ciclo populista olvidó, que es que la gente quiere ser considerada, representada, y aunque las políticas públicas no sean las mejores, por lo menos que parezcan que están pensados en ellos. Y lo que Trump ha hecho muy bien, López Obrador y Klaus han hecho muy bien, en Polonia han hecho muy bien los gobernantes más populistas, es que hablan a un sector de la población que se sentían excluidos por ese discurso meritocrático de competitividad que el neoliberalismo en áreas de la eficiencia generó y que permitió cierto tipo de crecimiento que no existía antes, etc. Entonces yo creo que ahí es donde estamos frente a un dilema muy interesante. Déjame nada más cerrar con el caso de México, porque el caso de México, no solo cada cantón habría que pensar sobre la diferencia de cada cantón, sino luego vemos a América Latina como un mismo fenómeno, al populismo como un mismo fenómeno, y el populismo mexicano es muy particular. Primero, porque aunque es un populismo de izquierda, en la práctica su lógica de izquierda tiene un solo concepto redistributivo que en el fondo es profundamente friedmaniano, que es yo reparto dinero. En vez de repartir vouchers, reparten dinero. Entonces, un gobierno muy chiquito, el gobierno mexicano, tiene 25% del PIB de gasto, realmente su margen fiscal es muy estrecho, el grueso del gasto se concentra en pensiones no contributivas, becas, apoyos para A, B, C y D. El presupuesto en salud, educación y bienes públicos se ha contraído brutalmente. Entonces, es de izquierda en el sentido que reparte, es de izquierda en el sentido que hizo una política laboral que permitió un aumento en el salario real, que es su gran triunfo de política económica, pero es absolutamente neoliberal en construir un Estado que pueda construir las capacidades reales para incorporar a la economía moderna y más con los retos de la inteligencia artificial en educación, salud, etcétera, a la población de este país. Y es un gobierno que, a diferencia de los populismos de América Latina del pasado, que resolvían la presión política emitiendo dinero, creciendo, funcionaba durante algún tiempo. En Argentina los ciclos son muy evidentes. Es un gobierno que decidió ser macroeconómicamente prudente, aceptar que se va a crecer poco. El crecimiento del sexenio pasado fue de 0.8%, cuando la economía de Estados Unidos creció 2.4%. La economía en lo que va de este año de Claudia Sheinbaum se va a crecer a 0.5%, cuando la economía de Estados Unidos está creciendo 2%, pero le apuestan a que esa redistribución les alcance políticamente.
Very much agree. For me, the most central in all this story with populism is nationalization of the elites. You're not nationalizing industries anymore, not particularly attractive. But you go for nationalizing of the elites because from the point of view of the people, the last 35 years have been the liberation of the elites. It's not simply that you have a major income discrepancy, which is enormous, and everybody was measuring, and basically we know how big it is, but simply you cannot control the elite by the state. The nature of the capital has changed. I can move out. You cannot tax me. And secondly, also with the end of the Cold War, part of the elites lost the fear of a government that can come and nationalize you and basically kill you. So from this point of view, suddenly you have an elites which are not simply becoming richer, but they don't feel totally, particularly in small states, they don't care about the national governments. They show how much they don't care about the national governments. What I saw in countries of Eastern Europe, for example, my own country, Bulgaria, 15 years ago, if you're a politician and you speak foreign language, this was perceived as an advantage. You're better educated, you're probably going better to defend the interest of the country. And then suddenly, what was very important for many of these populist leaders, which is not true for Orban, but it's true for Kaczynski, they don't speak foreign languages. Because suddenly they're telling to the people, do you know what? We're together. I don't have an exit. I'm going to stay with you. And this story, stay with us, is becoming critically important. And from my point of view, this is the interesting about the Trump phenomena, because people all the time talk about the corruption of the previous system. Listen, Mr. Trump can be accused of many things, but he cannot be accused of not being corrupt. This is not something that he's hiding. This is not something, this is not about this. But in my view, this is very important that suddenly you have this type of a government and said, no, if you want to basically steal, you should stay here. Your kid should be here. And by the way, the Russian government was the first to do this. It was extremely important. This was Putin's project. If you want to steal in Russia, be sure that your kids are going to be in the country and that basically you're going to be in the country.
You are trapped here. You have to be loyal.
Yeah, you should be there. And I do believe this kind of a story, how to deal with the elites, because during this 35 period, I do believe all over the world, people get more rights, but they don't have the feeling that they get more power. Because the rights was coming from institutions, from the general environment, from the fact that you can move basically. Also people discovered that it's much easier to change the country if you don't like it than to change the government of a country that you don't like it. So this is why migration became so important. But what you're doing with the elites. And if you see in this sovereignist moved everywhere, in a strange way, all these kind of global elites were pushed to give a loyalty pledge. So when the technological companies go to meet Trump and treat him in a very emperor way, this is also a show which they're showing to the American public that we're an American company. Suddenly there is no cosmopolitans anymore. Suddenly everybody goes with their national identities. Companies become American. By the way, sanction regimes are very much also contributing to this. And in my view, this is new, and this is part of this basic deglobalization, which is not simply economic policy.
Well, deglobalization seems to be very real. We had a period from 1990 to 2000 when world trade increased faster than the world economy. We had a period from 2000 to 2010 where world trade increased slower than the world economy, and this got nicknamed the period of slowbalization. And now we seem to be in a period of deglobalization. And as I said, there aren't that many answers. Where does deglobalization lead? It leads to war. This is very, you're hearing this very ominously in the United States, and you're seeing it in China. Both countries are putting themselves more on a war footing. The United States quite expressly so. The Trump administration talks again and again about how we have to have a more militarized economy. We need to re-domicile our supply chains, even though it means we're all going to be poorer, because we have to get ready to have a war footing. Hence the change of the name, the quite illegal name of the change of the name of the Department of Defense to the Department of War. It's an illegal act. The Department of Defense was created by Congress in 1947. It was named by Congress in 1949. The president can't change the name. But it is revealing a mentality, which is the reason the Department of Defense got its new name in 1949 was partly so that the Army and the Navy would stop squabbling, to bring them all into one building, and the Air Force too, but also to say the United States uses its military power to maintain a world structure of peace and security. It is not looking to fight big wars in the future. It is looking to prevent wars, to apply military power to security problems, but to prevent general wars. Now it seems to be quite explicit in the Trump administration. They want a general war with China. They're getting ready for one. And when you get ready for one, you make it more likely. And the Chinese too, as they reimpose larger and larger elements of command on more and more of their economy. They're not as reckless in the way they talk as the Trump administration is. But you can see the intention, and it is also deeply menacing. And the behavior becomes more aggressive. So as I say, there are not that many solutions. There's commerce and there's conflict.
Talking about war, you mentioned Russia. What's happening with the Russian economy and the Putin regime as an example of how or how not economy affects an illiberal regime?
Listen, Putin is a great study of this process of deglobalization, which at one and the same time was very important for Russia to be part of the global economy, because Russia is very much depending on the export of natural resources. From this point of view, in many respects, Russia managed to achieve the communist ideal not to exploit people, because they're mostly exploiting natural resources. No, but if you see, basically 40% of the Russian budget is coming from oil. What they did, and this was very interesting, because they very much used the West to do what they wanted to do. First, after Crimea, when the Western sanctions was put, suddenly the Russians came with a counter-sanctions on agricultural products. And all my American economist friends said, the Russians are crazy. No, they were not crazy. They were preparing for the war. When you are preparing for the war, for you, food sufficiency is critically important. So they came with the tariffs in order basically to go classical import substitution story to basically prepare the economy for the war situation. And secondly, of course, what they started to do very much is try to cut Russia from the global financial market, because they expected what is going to happen with the financial sanctions. They basically was trying to get their internet, very much the idea of the digital sovereignty. So I agree very much with David on the fact that even when the war is not the objective, only way to try to convince people to go on this type of a fortress states economy is to try to threaten them that war is possible. And this is what happened in Russia. Russia is a strange and particular economy, but also Russia shows one major analytical, in my view, failure on the Western way to understand what was going on. I have been present on tens and thousands of presentations of how corrupt Russia is, and because they are totally corrupt, you can easily basically go after them, because they are never going to do anything that is going to hurt their banking accounts. Listen, you should be very much underpaid academic to believe that the president of the nuclear state, who have been in power for 20 years, think in terms of his bank account. This is not how President Putin thinks. Yet it's a very corrupt system. This is not true for anybody, but he was not in power simply basically to have his bank account. And as a result of it, we failed for our misunderstanding of the nature of the Russian regime. The fact that you're corrupt does not mean that this is the way that is basically all your major objectives are defined. And this is why the economic sanctions, which were perceived as the new weapon. By the way, for the American administration, sanctions were critically important, not simply because of Russia, but because in the beginning, Biden administration, and particularly Jack Sullivan, was very clear on this. This is the new weapon, this economic weapon, and we're going to do on Russia something that Chinese can understand, why they cannot withstand certain things. You do this. And then do you know what was, and which is probably less known for you, how Russia survived the first 2 years? Because 2022 was very tough for Russian economy. Paradoxically, Russia was saved by liberalism. The very liberal leadership of the central bank. Russia has extremely, by the way, competent central bank leadership, which was very much created during the liberal 1990s. They're one of the most fiscally, by the way, stable and conservative in the world, and they were very competent in how they're dealing with the financial story. But secondly, in the first 2 years of the sanctions, what the most important thing that happened in Russia is that tax inspections of small and medium businesses almost disappeared. Never before small and medium businesses have been in a better situation. Because the tax inspection in Russia means that they're coming, they're asking money from you, you should give them money. If you're not going to give them money, you're going to have a problem. And suddenly, basically, with the decision of the president, no tax inspections. And also, I'm not interested how you're going to violate the sanctions, but I want to have the goods on the market. This, by the way, is changing now because Russia has a fiscal problem, so Russia started going after companies, and 4 times there was increase for the last year of the tax inspections. But paradoxically, liberalizing the market saved Russia in 22-23, and you have more new small and medium businesses that have been created in Russia in 2023 than in the previous 5 years. So from this point of view, to understand how different economies deal with this, because of course in the case of Russia, you have a major isolation, there was market and so on. They're going to pay in the long term a very high price. But then at the same time, we know that the economic cost that Russia is paying is not enough to change the military objectives of the Putin government. And this is an important thing, and going back to China, and this is my last point, there is a new book being published recently by an economist who has been in China for a long time, American economist, which is called Breakneck. And he's comparing Russia, not Russia, but United States and China as an engineering state versus the lawyer state. And it is true that the nature of the elites are very different. Basically, a big majority of the people of position of power in China has engineering education. So as a result of it, everything good and everything bad comes from this. Good, a lot of public works, if you see their railways and if you see their public infrastructure is great. Bad because if you see their anti-COVID policy and what they did to their country was also based on the fact that they have a matrix that is typical for engineering. But on the side of the United States, the story is what Fukuyama calls vitocracy, that the system was created that it is very difficult to build. In a certain way, everybody has a lawyer. It's very easy to stop any type of a project. In a certain way, the most important things about kind of liberal economy, the fact that people and companies have rights, have turned against basically the productive nature of the economy. And from this point of view, I do believe we are in a moment in which all major economies are trying to decide who you want to be. So it's going to be an identity change moment. I don't believe that Russia has much to change on this. It's much more constrained there. But for the United States, even this talk about affordability that comes from Mamdani, this is very much about also building. You should build things, public things. You should try to be able to create, for example, housing, things that in a certain way liberal societies have been failing big.
Reaccionando al tema del poder, la guerra y el ejemplo que Rusia le da a los europeos, que estamos de regreso a un mundo donde lo que importa es el poder y no las instituciones. Creo que para América Latina, cómo Trump resuelva el esfuerzo que está haciendo de construir una estrategia frente a los gobiernos populistas de la primera generación en América Latina, en concreto Venezuela y Cuba, esta idea de que llega un grupo al poder, llega con el apoyo amplio de una población que se siente no representada, van centralizando el poder, destruyendo las instituciones y se quedan disrumpiendo, digamos, el orden democrático, aislándose del mundo, acercándose a China y a Rusia. Y esa, en la visión de Trump, que cree que el poder es para usarse, que América es para los americanos, pues es el que hoy tenga al 15% de su fuerza militar en el Caribe, enfrente de Venezuela, pues no debe de ser algo que difícilmente no va a terminar en algo. Y si esto termina Es una posibilidad, no digo que vaya a suceder, pero si esto termina ya sea con Maduro negociando una salida, con un golpe interno para deponer a Maduro, con algún ataque militar que elimine a alguna de las gentes cercanas a Maduro o al propio Maduro, el equilibrio en Estados Unidos, en América Latina respecto a su relación con Estados Unidos va a cambiar de forma dramática, y los gobiernos que en el siglo XX en América Latina, sobre todo la segunda mitad, lograron una amplia autonomía respecto a Estados Unidos, el mero hecho de que la isla de Cuba siga siendo gobernada por Fidel Castro a unas cuantas millas de Florida es un símbolo de cómo cambió el poder en la segunda mitad del siglo XX, cómo siendo el gobierno más poderoso del mundo, tuvo que enfrentar una serie de restricciones, aún después de la caída de la Unión Soviética. Podrías argumentar que mientras la Unión Soviética estaba ahí, hubiera puesto en riesgo algún tipo de escalamiento militar. Cuba ha estado aislada, prácticamente en el estancamiento económico o incluso en la destrucción más dramática de sus capacidades productivas, cuarta parte de la población cubana saliendo de Cuba, y sin embargo Estados Unidos no ha podido hacer nada, y creo que con Trump hay el anuncio de un objetivo distinto. Le tiene sin cuidado las reglas internacionales, estas lanchas que incinera con presuntos delincuentes ahí enfrente, pues viola cualquier principio de derecho internacional, pero no le ha costado políticamente nada, y creo que cómo termine esto va a definir el espacio de maniobra que tienen aquellos gobiernos que construyen regímenes populistas, estatistas, antinorteamericanos, etcétera, en la región.
Carlos, este intervencionismo americano del que hablas, que tiene una acción, está teniendo una acción militar, pero hay otro tipo de intervencionismo que hemos visto recientemente y que quizá toca con alguno de los temas de esta mesa muy directamente, que es lo que ha ocurrido con Estados Unidos y el gobierno de Milei, y con el peso argentino y con esas elecciones y con ese giro radical en las encuestas respecto de lo que ocurrió finalmente en los resultados. Bueno, es un intervencionismo muy fuerte, ¿no? Y insólito hasta el momento. ¿Qué lectura haces también de esa?
Sí, de hecho es parte de un patrón más general. El fracasado pero intento de intervenir en Brasil en defensa de su amigo Bolsonaro. Es decir, Trump lo que le proyecta interna y externamente es que si eres mi amigo estoy contigo, si no eres mi amigo puedo estar contra ti. Y en el caso de Milei, pues era de todos los presidentes de América Latina el que más se acercó a Trump y a la Casa Blanca desde el principio. Incluso su estrategia de la motosierra, su estrategia publicitaria de la motosierra fue captada por Elon Musk en su proyecto de tratar de reducir el gobierno de Estados Unidos. Y creo que para Trump era muy importante mandar una señal de que si me cuestan $20,000 millones, voy a estar contigo. Pero el otro lado que me parece bien interesante es que en el América Latina del pasado y en la elección en Argentina los peronistas, los kirchnerianos trataron de jugar ese juego. La intervención de Estados Unidos hubiera sido un motivo para no votar por Milei. Si el nacionalismo argentino, uno hubiera esperado en la vieja lógica del siglo XX, hubiera sido costoso el apoyo de Trump. Y luego de ser costoso, sucedió lo que tú dijiste.
Pero eso lo que indica es la depauperización de la Argentina y el pánico a vivir otro shock económico.
Absolutamente, pero aún en los shocks a veces los países se enredan en la bandera nacional. Aquí no se enredaron en la bandera nacional, y en parte por lo que dice, lo mismo en Venezuela. Si tú preguntas en Venezuela, ¿quieres una intervención de Estados Unidos? No hay encuestas que podamos citar confiables, pero lo que te dicen los que están en el terreno de juego es que una amplia parte de la población de Venezuela querría la intervención de Estados Unidos. Y eso es el costo del empobrecimiento que te generan estas políticas macroeconómicas absurdas, que en el corto plazo funcionan, en el mediano no, en el corto plazo te dan el poder, en el mediano no te pueden echar aunque tengas todo el poder. Y si en algún país se cumple lo que decía Gian de que es más fácil cambiar de país que cambiar de gobierno, es Venezuela. Una cuarta parte de la población de Venezuela optó por cambiar de país porque no podía cambiar de gobierno. Y en ese contexto, pues Estados Unidos se vuelve como la luz, digo, no digo que sea una acción correcta, ni respete las reglas internacionales, ni mucho menos, pero lo interesante, como lo pones tú, es que están tan pauperizadas las poblaciones que lo ven como una opción atractiva.
¿Cuál es tu lectura, David? What's your reading of these American interventions we just mentioned?
It was an example of Trump wanting to make the United States less like itself and more like somebody else. American interventions are obviously very frightening to the rest of the world. American military power is so enormous. And through history, whenever there has been one great power, Philip II, Louis XIV, the other powers combine against the great power. The United States, since 1945, has avoided that fate because it has provided security for free to everybody else. It's made its power not a threat to others, but a resource to them. And for those people, and Latin America has a different experience, but for the close American allies in Western Europe and Northwest Asia, American power was not a threat. American power allowed you to have a much more generous social welfare state than you otherwise would because you didn't have, and provided peace because the Germans and the French knew they couldn't fight each other anymore. That was over. It would not be allowed. And the United States has, since 1945, has understood that while it uses its power in its own interests, and sometimes quite selfishly and sometimes stupidly, it usually is concerned with some form of legitimation. In the past half century, since the Reagan era, there have been two major interventions that the United States did directly in Latin America. There was the Central American wars that were indirect but directly, the Grenada invasion in 1983, and the Panama invasion in 1990. And in Grenada in 1983, the United States created an international coalition of other Caribbean powers. And you can question how serious this was, but when 1,900 American troops went into Grenada in 1983, there were also, I believe, 300 troops from Jamaica, Barbados, and other Eastern Caribbean countries to say this is a multilateral invasion. And although that was perhaps a fiction, it was a legitimating device, and because the invasion was so swift, so cost-free to both Americans and the Grenadans too, and because the transition was so dramatic and successful, there wasn't a lot of question. In 1990, when President George H.W. Bush toppled Noriega, he didn't have a coalition that time, but there were court orders against Noriega, not only from the United States, but also from France, and I think from the pre-coup government of Panama itself. And so you could say, well, we are intervening not just because of President Bush's wish, but to honor an American court order. And indeed, after Noriega finished his court sentence in the United States, he went to France and served a court sentence in France. This time, there is no form of legitimation at all. There's no authorization by Congress. There's no authorization by any kind of international coalition. There are no allies. There are no partners. In fact, Trump is going out of his way to, the most important partner you could have in a military intervention in Venezuela is with Colombia. And Trump is going out of his way to alienate and insult Colombia. They're not helping either, but he's making it very easy for Colombia not to help. There's no public support at home. There's no budget. There's no appropriation. If the action, whatever it is cheap and easy and successful, then he won't need it. But if there's any difficulty, if there's any form of resistance, if the United States forces outrun their budgetary authority, he's got nothing. He's got no ability to go from Congress. So he is, and he is alarming everyone by saying that the central theory of American power from 45 to the first Trump administration is, as scary as it looks, you know what? It's not going. You can get on the right side of it. You can make it a resource for you. It will protect you more often than it will threaten you. There is no sense in combining against it. If this operation is one where, without that structure of legitimation, American power looks very frightening and very similar to Chinese power. And a lot of people who don't have deep cultural connections to the United States, I mean, the Europeans aren't going to change, the Japanese aren't going to change. But if the locus of competition becomes Southeast Asia and the Indian Ocean, countries like Indonesia, Vietnam, Malaysia, they have no fondness for the United States. They have no common history of cooperation. India, they regard the United States as just one great power, and they can balance them both. And in a world in which the United States power seems as unpredictable, or actually even potentially more unpredictable than Chinese power, as unconcerned with legitimation as China, maybe even less concerned with legitimation, you put a lot of countries into positions where they have to make their own choices in a way that is very dangerous to long-term security for the United States and very dangerous for the peace of the world.
So here I got some questions from the audience, and one of the questions, David, is about the Chinese currency and how does it affect its how does it affect the commerce, the way the currency in China is controlled by the government. And the question says, funciona el partido único y el mercado. One party and market, does it work? Does that combination work?
Look, China is an economy, depending on how you count, 2/3 or 3/4 the size of the United States. And it's obviously a bigger population. So you would think you'd be able to walk into a store anywhere in the world with a stack of Chinese money, and it should be somewhat accepted. But my understanding is if you take a $100 American bill anywhere, it will buy something. And if you take Chinese money outside of China, it will buy nothing. And that is because that currency forms, money's a very mysterious thing, it forms many functions. And one of the things that is really alarming about the United States is the United States dollar is a great asset. And the Trump administration seems bent on destroying it too with these cryptocurrency subversions. And I'm writing in the middle of writing a big article about how radical and dangerous this is. In order to basically finance short-term borrowing of the United States, in order to drag more people to buy American debt, they're compromising the sacredness and integrity and universal acceptability of the dollar in ways that detract from American power and wealth. But China's currency, again, I don't know what happens if you walk into a bar in Kinshasa with a stack of Chinese money. I bet they don't take it. And I bet they do take a $100 American bill.
Particularly, they'll take gold these days.
Very hard to put gold in your shoe.
Hay una pregunta también para Carlos y también relacionada con China. La pregunta tiene una introducción algo larga sobre Norberto Bobbio, pero la pregunta en sí es la aspiración de estos populismos nuevos imitar el modelo político económico chino. Esto voy a añadir algo más. Me ha parecido muy interesante lo que has contado del modelo clientelar de ayudas públicas en detrimento de otro tipo de políticas públicas más amplias, con más proyección de futuro, quizá más sostenibles y como con la promesa de construir sociedades mejores en su conjunto, no solo apoyando a un segmento muy particular de la población y de una manera con ayudas directas, como has mencionado. Y esto, enlaza con el debate que ha habido actualmente en Estados Unidos durante la campaña de la alcaldía de Nueva York, de el tipo de los dos modelos de ayuda, si es la ayuda para todos o la ayuda para los más necesitados, y cuál sería el modelo que se debe seguir.
Gracias al público y a ti, Andrea. En el caso de la pregunta primera, los gobiernos de América Latina quieren coquetear con China, unos lo hacen muy bien, otros menos bien, no necesariamente por afinidad ideológica o admiración, sino porque les sirve como contrapeso a Estados Unidos, porque son economías, salvo México, para las cuales el mercado chino ya es más interesante que el de Estados Unidos. De hecho, el gobierno mexicano, primero con AMLO y luego con Claudia, coqueteó un poco con esta idea de vamos a buscar equilibrar nuestra dependencia de Estados Unidos con China, pero las condiciones objetivas, básicas, elementales, es que uno, con China competimos, no nos complementamos. Un poco a tu pregunta, David, si México dejara de exportarle coches a Estados Unidos, ¿cuántos coches de estos los compraría China? Como con lo de los billetes, 0. Los chinos tienen sus propios coches, nos los exportan a nosotros. Brasil exporta soya, nosotros exportamos manufactura y el gobierno mexicano entendió que había que buscar quedarse en la órbita de América del Norte e incluso tienen muy claro que parte de la renegociación del Tratado de Libre Comercio va a ser cómo ponemos un arancel, sino como un similar a China, pues para evitar la triangulación de productos en caso que podamos salvar el tratado con arancel 0 al grueso de los productos entre ambos países. Pero desde el punto de vista ideológico, para este gobierno de Claudia Sheinbaum, no sé para otros de la región, si hay un enorme así como admiración de un estatismo que sí funciona y se imaginan a sí mismos que pueden de alguna forma emular eso. Pero creo que es una mera fantasía por varias razones, pero la más importante es que parte del triunfo de este tipo de gobiernos como el de México, el de Andrés Morena, es tan brutalmente antielitista, tan estrictamente antimeritocrático. Andrés Manuel López Obrador decía en las mañaneras del pasado que los que se iban o los que nos íbamos a estudiar al extranjero, nos íbamos al extranjero para aprender a robar. No solo no nos quedábamos en México, no utilizábamos los valores educativos mexicanos, sino allá aprendíamos a hacer las peores cosas posibles. Se ha construido una lógica absolutamente antimeritocrática. Las elecciones del Poder Judicial que tuvieron lugar en junio del 24, además de que violenta todos los principios fundamentales de la separación de poderes, sin entrar a las partes más teóricas del respecto, estaba basado en el principio de cualquiera puede ser juez. Antes era un proceso con fallas y lo que tú quieras, para meritocrático. Sí. Y al final para élites. Entonces, la ministra de la Suprema Corte, Lenia Batres, del ala más radical de Morena, antes de ser ministra de la Corte vivía en un departamento, le llamamos vecindades, departamentos muy pequeños, hacinados, y salió un video de ella gritándole a su vecina de la forma más vulgar. En la élite lo vemos, qué horror, esa va a llegar como ministra. En el grueso de la población lo ven, yo también puedo llegar a ministra. Entonces, eso ha erosionado las capacidades del Estado mexicano, que de por sí nunca fueron muy sólidas, que hace el sueño chino prácticamente imposible en lo general y difícil incluso en temas específicos. Un tema que conozco con cierto detalle, que es Pemex. Llevan ya 7 años en el poder con el lema rescatando la soberanía, el estatismo sí funciona, vamos a hacer de Pemex una gran empresa petrolera y ninguno de los indicadores que prometen se cumplen porque las capacidades de gestión están tan erosionadas que no van a poder hacerlo, creo, nunca. Entonces, ese tipo de competencias no las tienen y en parte eso explica, y ahí el observador es bien inteligente y sensible, dijo, pues mira, yo no puedo asegurarte que te llegue salud, eso es muy complicado, hay que meterle mucho dinero, pues sí puedo asegurar que te llegue dinero. Y entonces el intercambio es muy sencillo, yo te doy dinero y tú luego resuelves tus temas de salud por otro lado. Paradójicamente, el modelo neoliberal de transferencias de recursos que lo hubo era focalizado. La idea es lo vamos a llevar solo a los más pobres y lo vamos a llevar con criterios condicionados. Yo te doy el dinero a ti, Andrea, si tú llevas a tus hijos a la escuela y al centro de salud. Si no, no te lo doy. El modelo de AMLO es completamente universal, no es paternalista, porque esto tiene una lógica muy paternalista, es universal. Yo puedo a partir de los 65 años de edad ir a cobrar la pensión no contributiva, o sea, no está focalizado, y de hecho la información te muestra que los más pobres que no tienen la información, que hay muchas de estas transferencias, no les llegan en la misma proporción que a otros deciles, entonces lejos de... No solo en la universalización no es que ahora les llega a todos, sino les llegan más a aquellos sectores que saben que existen esos derechos. Entonces, para cerrar con tu pregunta final, yo creo que ese tipo de dilema México o el gobierno de Claudia Sheinbaum lo ha tratado de resolver con dar ese dinero, y hay un esfuerzo infructuoso de ampliar un poco las capacidades de salud y otras cosas, pero hasta ahora no han podido hacer. Hay coqueteos con ideas de vamos a congelar las rentas, vamos a hacer A y B, pero hasta ahora se han dado cuenta que pues, eso, en un contexto donde el Estado no tiene capacidades de construir viviendas, aunque está haciendo un gran plan de viviendas, pero es como para un sector mucho más de clase baja, pues no tiene demasiada salida. Entonces yo creo que la paradoja del populismo de López Obrador y de Claudio Sheinbaum es un Estado muy chiquito repartiendo dinero y casi no haciendo nada más. Un dato final para que veas de qué tamaño es el pequeñito Estado mexicano. Ojalá tuviera, digamos, no tiene la capacidad de reprimir el consumo ni mucho menos. El Estado mexicano invierte este año 2 puntos del PIB. La inversión privada son 20 puntos del PIB. Es un Estado que sabe que sin la inversión privada el anémico crecimiento mexicano sería aún más frágil.
Gracias, Carlos. Iván, let's close with you. Would you like some final remarks? And then this discussion will be over. So.
No, we can even finish without my final remarks. But because in my view, what was really interesting listening to the other participants is that we're going into a different type of an economy. It's not that one small country decided to deglobalize. The United States decided to go on this. And the problem is that this is changing the choices of everybody else. Even countries that want to stay very much integrated in the global economy, by the way, European Union is fighting for this, and if you talk to Japanese and others, they cannot do it in the way it was before. And as a result of it, when, by the way, Trump came to power, European Council on Foreign Relations have been doing a survey around the world. And he was not welcomed in Europe, in South Korea, but he was quite welcomed everywhere else. People believe that Trump is going to be better for peace, better for America, better for their relations. And one of the story was, and this was interesting, they were reading his tariff policy as I'm not interested in any ideologies. I don't care about your regime. I don't care about your sovereignty. Only what you care is the surplus with the US. And this is not true. Basically, Brazil does not have a major trade surplus. So policy towards Brazil is very much about politics. Support for Argentina is very much about politics. So he's learning basic things, that you have friends and enemies. And I'm saying this because I want to end on something. Economy is going to change. They're going to be dramatic. Obviously, there is new regionalism. I very much agree with you. Mexico does not have a choice to go with China. Ideologically, you can even start speaking Chinese, but it's not going to change the nature of your economy. And also, and this is my last point, being Chinese is not easy. And it is so not easy that they're not exporting their model anymore. If you go back to the 1989, Soviets and Chinese leadership ended on the same page. Both of them agreed that the system does not work. But they disagree strongly what was
the next step,
effective and what was wrong. Gorbachev was a man of ideology, and he believes that what was good was the socialist ideas, what was bad was the party state. Chinese decided that what was not really important was the ideology, but what was really good was the party state, because it can deliver different things here and there. And I do believe creating a state that can deliver is becoming a problem for both democracy and authoritarian regimes. The weakness of authoritarianism is that the fact that you have a strong man does not mean that you have a strong power. And this is true, by the way, even in the case of Russia. You can be strong on television and you can do things here and there, but for example, President Putin was very personally concerned about COVID, as we know. He protected himself a lot, but he never dared to go with a mass vaccination because he was afraid how public was going to react. Only the Chinese went full on this because they believed in their capacity to impose. And from this point of view, the state weakness is going to be a problem both for democracies and authoritarian regimes in a moment in which basically global economy goes in pieces.
Okay, so before we all leave, quiero decir gracias y también en la conexión para seguir la siguiente mesa por live stream, tienen que volver a conectarse. La siguiente mesa es el malestar en las sociedades liberales con Ian Buruma, Iván Krastev, Mark Lila, Leon Weiseltier y Enrique Krauze. Muchas gracias.
A ti. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure.
It was a great pleasure.